I've read is that the history started from the Haymarket Affair. The Haymarket Affair was...
The Haymarket Massacre.
It was kind of an aftermath of a protest for an 8-hour workday, which
right.
is kind of the start of the fair labour practice movement.
It actually started before that. It started in the early 19th century in France.
Okay.
So prior to that, workers were working 18 to 20-hour days, 7 days a week.
Sure.
And the French hit the streets and they said, this is enough, we're going to do a protest. And they managed to get it down to 12 hours and a six-day work week, and they thought that was a victory. And it was only later on in the century that this massacre happened. And the Americans took to the streets and they said, no, we want an 8-hour day. And it was on the 1st of May that this thing happened. So yeah, it started then.
Now, from what I read as well, that after the Haymarket Affair, there was, on the 1st of May the following year, there was a massive international protest for the same thing, wasn't it?
Yes.
And that was effectively the start of now we're coming to celebrate this day,
Yeah.
To commemorate the fact that workers were getting a raw deal.
Yeah, now they're getting rights and they,
And now we've got rights. So now that's progressed like quite far now. We're in 2019.
Yeah.
And I know that the unions in South Africa particularly used the 1st of May to protest for the end of apartheid and things like that.
Yeah, so the 1st of May during the apartheid era, every time the 1st of May came, they had massive demonstrations in the streets and whatnot. And in those days it was illegal. You know, 1st of May wasn't recognised here as a public holiday, but they pushed it. And then when, of course, the new government came in, 1st of May became an official public holiday, and it was to celebrate the victories that the unions had in actually bringing this day forward and bringing human rights into the workplace and all of that stuff. So
That was quite cool.
Yeah.
But now the idea of unions has changed, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
the unions back then was creating a lot of change.
Yeah, well, the unions then were the only voice that non-white people had back in the day, the only sort of political voice that they had. So that's why a lot of unions today still have a very political culture, because they formed an alliance with the ANC, which was in exile. The ANC fed them support to further their cause in the workplace and, of course, bring about change in the whole economy. And that's how it worked. And so that's why there's a strong alliance between unions and the government of today, because the history goes way back.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of coming to there's the new act, so there's the Labour Relations Act, which has changed quite a bit, and then there's the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. How do those two tie into fair labour practices, and which one's more relevant?
Well, before the new government came into being, workers, especially non-white workers, were exploited. They had very, very poor working conditions. Health and safety wasn't an issue, and basically employers could do what they liked. So the new government came in and said, we have to regulate this. We had this nice constitution that gave everybody good rights, a whole bill of rights, all awesome. And they said we need to translate that constitution into worker-friendly labour laws. So the Basic Conditions of Employment Act gave the right to work, it gave the right to regulate working hours, etc., etc., and the Labour Relations Act gave the right of a worker to have fair labour practices and to have a right to join a union and have a right to strike and to declare disputes and all of those things. So those are the two main pillars of worker rights. And then there's a third one, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So there's a right to work in a safe environment, free of hazard, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. There's a right to work, which is basically governed by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, and that's all regulated about how you can work, so maximum 45-hour work week. If you work beyond that, you have a right to be paid overtime, etc., etc. And then Labour Relations Act is the right to have fair labour practices, the right to associate with a union, the right to bargain collectively with your employer, the right to strike. So all those rights were enshrined, and the 1st of May was the day that this government decided to celebrate workers, to celebrate them as an important aspect of our society, and their rights must be upheld.
Cool. Now, how long have you been in this game in terms of your HR consulting? You've been
I've been in the HR field since 1990, and I've been in the consulting field since the year 2000. So it's been quite a while. 1990-2000.
Now, in your experience, from even back to 1990, do you think we've progressed further to fairer labour practices? Are employees getting a better deal? Have those acts had any impact on the working world?
Yeah, they have, especially now with this latest national minimum wage. Prior to, during the days of apartheid, there was no national minimum wage. If you wanted to pay someone 10 Rand a month and they agreed to it, you could. And basically, the labour union or the labour movements were saying, well, it's still slavery in a way. So certain industries were actually legislated, like the wholesale and retail industry. There was a minimum wage per different roles. Hospitality industry, the cleaning industry, but most weren't. So they made amendments to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and said, well, now there's a right to earn a national minimum wage so that you can at least live with a little bit of dignity. And it's not quite where COSATU and the unions want it, but it's a start. So I reckon every year they're going to push for more and more of a national minimum wage, a bigger and bigger wage. So that changed. And it was really a case of just making employers aware that employees have rights. And that's what this act is all about. So although the act actually dropped down in at the turn of when the new democratic government came in, employers were still very much unaware. So they still did their own thing, and then unions were the catalyst that brought about that change. So the unions would say, hang on, you're doing that, you shouldn't be doing that, the law says this. So not much has really changed in terms of the law since then, but it's just a case of employers are now being compelled more and more to actually comply with that. So if I go back to 1995, workers were still a bit scared to speak up. They didn't know their rights. Employers either knew what their rights were but didn't want to obviously honour that, or they too were ignorant. So this whole process from then to now has been quite an awareness exercise. And we're at a point now where the Department of Labour is quite heavy now. They're enforcing things quite strictly.
Okay.
Unions are getting quite vigilant about it. And employers are also setting up and saying, you know what, we need to look after our workers. It's simple as that.
So now, for a company, let's say there's a relatively small, like an SME, who is now having an experience where a union is now starting to get in, starting to speak to the workers. So that whole process of the beginning of the unionization of their little workforce, what advice do you have for like a small business like that? What can they do? Should they reach out to someone like yourself?
Yes.
What is the process?
Yeah, look, when a company becomes unionized, obviously there's only one focus that the union has, and that's to maximize the rights of an employee. But an employer too has rights, and sometimes they don't know those rights, and they don't know where to strike the balance. And sometimes they become hard-headed, and they say, we aren't going to recognize you, which ends up being costly because they end up going to labour court, and there's lawyers' fees and all of that stuff. Or they're just unaware of where their rights start and end, and where their employees' rights start and end. So for every right there's an obligation. So for every employee right, the employer has an obligation, and for every employer right, the employee has an obligation. And it takes a person that is skilled in HR to understand that and to guide both parties through that whole process so that they can eventually start working in a harmonious fashion. But for a small company, I would advise them to bring on someone that is a specialist, engage them, and allow them to manage the relationship between union and employer.